It's a moment no one saw coming, when a routine police stop takes a dangerous turn. A black teen, just walking down the street, is suddenly face to face with a police officer who orders his K9 to attack. But what the officer doesn't know is that this teen's father isn't just any bystander. He's a police captain, and he's watching from just a few yards away. Tension builds as the situation escalates, with the officer unaware of the powerful connection that could change everything. How will the teen's father react? And what happens when this confrontation takes a shocking twist that no one expects? Stick around to find out how one unexpected move could change the course of the night, and possibly the future of police accountability. The teen, Jamal, had never imagined his evening would end like this. It was just a regular walk home from his friend's house, but the moment he turned the corner, a police cruiser pulled up, and before he could react, the officer had already shouted at him to stop. He hadn't done anything wrong. His hands were visible, his movements calm, but the officer, a young guy named Officer Harris, seemed quick to make assumptions. Jamal's heart raced, and he tried to stay composed, but then the officer's K9 partner barked loudly, its leash snapping taut. The situation spiraled, and Jamal knew things were escalating faster than he could control. What Officer Harris didn't realize was that Jamal's father, Captain Reynolds, had just pulled into the nearby parking lot. He wasn't supposed to be working, but when he saw the flashing lights, something told him to check it out. He had no idea that this moment would challenge everything he believed in. The air in the small town felt heavy, almost suffocating. It had been days since the storm, and the aftermath was still fresh in everyone's minds. People tried to go about their daily routines, but there was an underlying sense of unease, a feeling that something had shifted. The wreckage of broken trees, flooded streets, and damaged homes had been dealt with, but there were more pressing matters beneath the surface. Lucy sat by the window, staring out at the grey sky. Her thoughts kept drifting back to that night, when the storm had torn through the town with a ferocity no one had anticipated. It wasn't just the wind or the rain that had rattled her. It was the way it felt like the storm had brought something else with it, something darker. She had tried to speak to Tom about it, but he was too consumed by the logistics of the cleanup. The town's mayor, Greg, was pushing everyone to pull together, to rebuild quickly, but Lucy felt the pressure building in her chest, like a dam about to burst. The storm wasn't the only thing they needed to fear. Across town, Tom stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the wreckage of the old mill. It had been abandoned for years, but it still stood, a silent reminder of the town's once thriving industry. Now, the storm had ripped through it, exposing cracks in the structure that no one had noticed before. It wasn't just a building falling apart. It was the last thread holding together the fragile fabric of the town's history. There were whispers now, circulating among the few who still dared to speak up. People had started noticing things, strange things, since the storm. A few missing animals, odd shadows in the woods, eyes watching from the dark corners of buildings. Lucy wasn't the only one feeling the shift. Tom hadn't given much weight to the rumors at first. He was a practical man, grounded in the here and now. But there was something about the way the air felt, something off in the way the locals avoided certain parts of town. When he was at the mill earlier, something had caught his attention, a glimpse of something moving in the wreckage. A figure, perhaps, or just a trick of the light, but it had been enough to make his pulse quicken. The town's growing unease wasn't just fueled by superstition. It was the disappearance of Sarah Turner that had everyone on edge. Sarah had been an upstanding member of the community, a teacher at the local school, well-liked by all. When she didn't come home after the storm, everyone assumed it was just a case of bad weather and disorientation. But days had passed, and there was no sign of her, no phone calls, no messages. Her husband, Michael, was frantic, but the town had grown silent in its search. Lucy couldn't help but think of the strange phone call she had received just hours before Sarah's disappearance. The voice on the other end had been muffled, barely audible, but she caught a few words. "She knows." It was that simple phrase that had sent a chill down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the storm. There had been rumors of strange happenings in the forest for months, whispers of figures moving in the trees and whispers of people gone missing over the years, but the town had dismissed them as fanciful tales. Now, with Sarah gone and the eerie sense of something not quite right in the air, Lucy's doubts were becoming harder to ignore. Meanwhile, Greg, the mayor, was struggling to hold everything together. The pressure was mounting on him to restore normalcy, but he could feel the cracks beginning to show. His decision to push for a quick cleanup of the storm damage was met with resistance from those who believed they should be addressing other concerns, like Sarah's disappearance and the unsettling reports from locals. The more Greg tried to deflect the growing fear, the more it seemed to consume him. At night, he found himself staring out of his office window, watching the shadows stretch longer across the streets, listening for any hint of movement that could confirm his growing paranoia. He had tried to keep the town unified, but the divisions were becoming clearer by the day. There was also Noah, the quiet teenager who had always kept to himself. He wasn't close to Sarah, but he had been one of the last to see her before she vanished. He'd been walking in the woods when he saw something that didn't belong. He couldn't describe it clearly, but he knew what he'd seen wasn't human. When he tried to tell his parents, they brushed it off as just another nightmare, another wild story from a teenager with too much time on his hands. Noah wasn't so sure anymore. The forest had always felt strange to him, but now it felt alive in a way he couldn't explain. He had started sneaking out at night, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him. It wasn't until he saw the figure again, near the old mill, that he started to understand. Whatever it wasn't going to stop. As the day stretched on, the town seemed to grow more fractured. People grew more suspicious of one another, and the whispers only grew louder. Lucy, Tom, and Noah found themselves unknowingly drawn into a web of secrets, each piece of the puzzle leading them closer to something ancient, something hidden in the town's history. But no one was willing to speak of it, not openly. There were forces at work, long buried, waiting for the right moment to resurface, and the storm had been the catalyst. No one knew what was coming next, but it was clear that nothing would be the same. The air was thick with tension, and with each passing hour, the truth seemed just out of reach, like a puzzle that was too difficult to solve. And yet, deep down, each of them knew that the answers would soon come, and when they did, they would change everything. Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Every day felt like a step closer to something terrible, something inevitable. She hadn't told Tom everything. The phone call, the whisper of "she knows." It gnawed at her. There had to be a connection between Sarah's disappearance and the strange things happening in town. She hadn't told him about the shadows in the woods either, how she had started to see them too, lurking just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the fading light of dusk. It wasn't paranoia. She knew that much. Something was moving in the darkness, something with purpose, and it was getting closer. Tom, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly distant, absorbed in the town's chaotic recovery. The mayor's pressure to rebuild quickly was weighing on everyone, but it was the rumors about the mill that had Tom distracted. The night after he had seen the figure in the wreckage, he had gone back. The structure had been unstable, but he couldn't resist. He had to know what was hidden beneath all the rubble. That night, when he had ventured inside the remains of the mill, a chill had settled over him. Unnatural, like the air itself had turned cold. The deeper he went, the more he felt as though the walls were closing in, like the building itself was trying to hold him in, to trap him. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw something pale, almost translucent, gliding past the broken windows. But when he turned, nothing was there. Only shadows, only silence. He had returned home shaken, but he didn't want to tell Lucy. She was already on edge, too worried about Sarah, too desperate for answers. But the truth was, he felt the same sense of urgency. Something was wrong with this place, something they couldn't explain away. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the storm had been the key. It wasn't just nature's fury. It had been a signal, a trigger that unleashed whatever had been hidden for so long. Noah couldn't sleep either. His dreams had been filled with the same images over and over, dark figures moving between the trees, eyes glowing like fireflies in the night. The figure by the mill had seen it again. Only this time, it had been closer, much closer. He could hear it now, footsteps soft on the ground, a whisper of breath in the wind, as if it were tracking him, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was only when he found the old map in his father's belongings, buried in a drawer in the attic, half forgotten, that the pieces began to fall into place. The map wasn't of the town itself, but of the land around it, the forests, the old pathways that led into the hills. The map was incomplete, as if it had been hastily drawn, but what caught his eye was a marking, an X scrawled in the exact spot where the storm had been its fiercest, the same spot near the mill, the same spot where the shadows seemed to gather. Noah didn't tell his parents. They still didn't believe him, and anyway, he knew they were too busy with their own lives to care. But he couldn't ignore what he had discovered. The storm had uncovered something ancient. He had to see it for himself. As the days passed, the town seemed to shrink into itself. People walked the streets with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, as if afraid of seeing something they weren't meant to see. Even Greg, the mayor, seemed different. He had grown pale, his eyes always darting to the corners of rooms, his hands constantly wringing together, as though trying to keep some invisible force from breaking free. There was a meeting that night, called by Greg, to address the growing concerns of the townspeople. Sarah's disappearance had become the center of it all. People were afraid, and they had every right to be. But there was something else in the air tonight, an anticipation, a sense that whatever had been building for weeks was finally reaching its breaking point. Lucy had gone to the meeting, though she hadn't planned to. She wanted to confront Greg, to demand answers. But as she walked through the door of the old town hall, a cold gust of wind followed her in, and the lights flickered. The room fell into an uneasy silence, and she felt the eyes of everyone there turn toward her. The tension was suffocating. Greg stood at the front, his hands clenched behind his back. He wasn't the same confident leader he had been just days ago. His voice was strained as he spoke, his words hurried and clipped. "We need to stay united," he said, his gaze darting nervously around the room. "We need to finish what we started. We rebuild, we restore, and we move on." But Lucy knew. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just trying to hold the town together. He was trying to keep something locked away. Before she could speak, a loud bang echoed through the hall. The front door slammed open, and in the doorway stood Tom, breathless, his face pale. "I found something," he said, his voice hoarse. "Something in the mill. It's not over. It's not just the storm." The room went dead silent, and then the whispers started. Tom's words hung in the air like a threat, and for the first time, Lucy understood what he meant. The storm had come for a reason. The mill wasn't just a building, it was a prison for something that had been waiting, growing, hidden in the town's dark past. Noah's heart raced as he stood outside the town hall, hidden in the shadows. He had to find out what it was. He had to get to the mill before it was too late. The final pieces were falling into place. The truth was within reach, and everything was about to change. Noah stood in the shadows, the cold night air biting at his skin as he watched the town hall's doors slowly close behind Tom. He could hear the murmurs inside, the sense of urgency building with every passing second. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was something else, something colder, more primal. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he had to act. He'd always felt like an outsider in this town, like something didn't quite fit, and now he was certain there was something buried here, something in the land, something connected to the storm. Whatever it was, it had awakened, and if he didn't get to the mill tonight, he wasn't sure if he'd get another chance. Noah darted from the shadows, heading toward the woods. The old paths were familiar to him, but tonight they felt different. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches creaking, almost as if they were alive. The world around him seemed to hum with a low, unsettling energy, and his footsteps felt heavier than usual as they crunched against the dry leaves.